Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires. True. Dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. And whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern all closed so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. And I undid the lantern just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, it was his evil eye. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, waiting on opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I turned back, but no. His room was black as pitch with the thick darkness, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door. So I pushed it on steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up on the bed crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle. In the meantime I did not hear him lie down. Still sitting up on the bed listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not the groan of pain or of pity, oh no. It was the low, stifled sound that rises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, oh, it is only the wind in the chimney. It's only a mouse crossing the floor. Or it's merely a cricket making a single chirp. Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he couldn't. It was all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, had enveloped the victim. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a little crevice in the lantern. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray shot from out the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray precisely upon the damned spot. And now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses? Now I say there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury. The beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could to maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and kept still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him from the bed and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe to you the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned and I worked quickly, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse, cut off the head, the arms, and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the floorings of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no blood stains of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I'd been too wary for that. The tub had caught all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused, and information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled for what had appeared. I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length into his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, with the perfect audacity of my complete triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they talked of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still the men sat, and still they chatted. The ringing became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I arose and argued about trifles, but the noise steadily increased. Why were they not begun? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, but the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, but the noise arose over all and grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible that they heard it not? Almighty God, no. They heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. But anything was better than this agony, anything more tolerable than this derision. I could hear and bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now again, hark! Louder, louder! Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more, I admit the deed. Here, tear up the planks. Here, here, it is the beating of his hideous heart. My breath for a moment, while we, for a moment or two, examine a definition of evil from Webster's Third New International Dictionary. I never know whether it's the new Third International Dictionary or the Third New. It seems to be a contradiction in terms no matter which way you say it. Evil, and we're dealing with the noun, not the adjective, from Middle English, evil. The first definition, the totality of undesirable, harmful, wicked acts, experiences, and things. Verbal illustration, and I like this edition with its examples of the words in action. We call them verbal illustrations, and here's one. Regarding evil as a necessary means of realizing the good, from Frank Tilly. The second definition, a cosmic force producing evil actions or states. The third definition, wickedness, sin, the verbal illustration. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you are dealing with a woman. You happen to be dealing with evil in its most absolute form. Hamilton Basso, I had nothing to do with that. I know that's pretty hard to take, ladies, but bear with me for a minute or two longer while we examine our civilization's first mention of the distaff side, and at the same time the first mention of evil. From the book of Genesis, excerpts from chapter 3. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldst not eat? And the man said, The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. And the Lord God said unto the woman, What is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And Adam called his wife's name Eve. Well, it would seem that womankind was the genesis of all evil. But not so. It was the snake. Still, ever mindful that Eve fell before Adam, allow me to point out and indeed confess on behalf of my own sex that although a woman could be a... That's a 5-letter word. A man can really be a... That's a 7-letter word. His first miserable, petty crime was to tattle on Eve. But down through the ages, he learned to do a lot worse than that. As attested not only in the documents or the documented accounts of wars and inquisitions, and in the records of courts of law, but over and over again in the literature of all civilizations, right down to our own time. Indeed, in our theater, in our films, and in our television. And I myself, as an actor, have had a pretty good time of it over the years, conjuring up some of the nastier incarnations of the male species. And I'm going to allude straight off to an episode from Dark Shadows, which I think you will all recognize. A scene between Barnabas and Julia, which illustrates just how much of a bastard man can be. One of the worst things that Barnabas did happened after he had conjured up the ghost of Dr. Dave Woodard to frighten Julia. And when she accuses him of causing the ghost to appear, he denies this, saying to Julia that it is not so, that I too have been threatened by the ghost. But Julia remains unconvinced, even when Barnabas tries to say that he's developed a conscience. And so, when he decides that her love for him is something to use here, he reminds her of that, to take advantage of the whole situation, to have her suspicions turned aside. Julia, oh, Dave Woodard didn't come into this room. I don't believe a word of it. Barnabas, so he's your ghost. Your guilt is so obsessive that you want to suffer alone. Oh, no, 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 I don't want to be alone ever. You know that. Julia, that's what I'm trying to tell you. I owe you so many apologies. You offered so much of yourself and I've chose to ignore it. Well, I can't do that any longer. I need you, Julia. Will you help me? I want to help you. I care for you, Julia. I need you. Well, I don't know. I'm all mixed up. When I came into this house, I don't think about why you came into this house. Tomorrow night we will talk it all over and spend the evening together. Julia, well, I must go. You won't be afraid now. Well, I have only one fear, that when I see you tomorrow night, I will find you changed again. That will not happen. Julia, good night, Barnabas. Good night, Julia. And Julia leaves. Didn't I once hear my little sister Sarah say that evil is wicked is well understood? The evil are punished, and so you must be good. Well, and where did I learn to act scenes like that? Well, listen to this piece of dialogue between Richard and Anne, followed by Richard's soliloquy on his sexual self-discovery in Shakespeare's King Richard III. But first, a brief background of the scene. By the time Richard seizes the crown, he will have eliminated 11 persons who stood in his way. In this early scene, Richard confronts Anne, his current obstacle, as she accompanies the cortege of her father-in-law, King Henry VI, Richard's latest victim. Anne, who is of royal blood and widowed young, her late husband, an earlier victim, is best kept alive, therefore, because Richard sees in her a prospective wife and future mother for his heirs. Well, we pick up towards the end of the scene, at the beginning of which Anne had tried to rid herself of Richard with such cries as, "Avaunt, thou dreadful minister of hell!" At this point, Richard has virtually won her. In fact, he's placing a ring upon her finger. "Look, how my ring encompasseth thy finger. Even so thy breast encloseth my poor heart. Wear both of them, for both of them are thine. And if thy poor devoted servant may but beg one favor at thy gracious hand, thou dost confirm his happiness forever." "What is it?" she asks. "That it may please you, leave these sad designs to him that hath most cause to be a mourner, and presently repair to Crosby House, where, after I have solemnly interred at Chertsey Monastery this noble king, and wet his grave with my repentant tears, I will with all expedient duty see you. For divers unknown reasons, beseech you, grant me this boon. With all my heart, and much it joys me too, to see you are become so penitent." And Richard says, "Bid me farewell. And 'tis more than you deserve, but since you teach me how to flatter you, imagine I have said farewell already." And Anne leaves. "Sirs, take up the course. Towards Chertsey, noble lord? No, to Blackfriars, and there attend my coming." Was ever woman in this humor wooed? Was ever woman in this humor won? I'll have her. Ha! What, I that killed her husband and his father, to take her in her heart's extremest hate, with curses in her mouth, tears in her eyes, the bleeding witness of my hatred, by having God, her conscience, and by these bars against me, and I no friends to back my suit withal, but the plain devil of dissembling looks, and yet to win her. All the world to nothing! Ha! Hath she forgot already that noble lord, Edward, her lord, whom I some 3 months since stabbed in my angry mood at Tewkesbury? And will she yet abase her eyes on me, that cropped the golden prime of this sweet prince, and made her widow to a woeful bed? On me that halts and am misshapen thus? My due to a beggarly denier, I do mistake my person all this while. Upon my life she finds, although I cannot myself, to be a marvellous proper man. But I would be at charges for a looking glass, and entertain a score or two of tailors to study fashion to adorn my body. Since I am crept in favor with myself, I will maintain it with some little cost. But first I'll turn yon fellow in his grave, and then return lamenting to my love. Shine out, fair sun, till I have bought a glass, that I may see my shadow as I pass. Eve was never that bad. Of course, to break a covenant or a contract with anyone, let alone with God, as Eve did, could easily be argued as the ultimate in evil, but that's a theme for a sermon, or for another Genesis, the Genesis of Evil 2. Oh, so many of the villains that I have played embodied pure evil of one kind or another, in that they revealed no redeeming sense of conscience or guilt. As Barnabas in his beginnings did not, or not very often. Now some of these creatures, like Don John the Bastard, I can say that word with impunity in this context. Now, Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing enjoyed themselves immensely wallowing in their evil doings. These roles were fun to do and not very demanding. Here is a brief quote from a Toronto review of my performance as Don John. Frid makes his mark in it, speaking well and looking as a brief villain should, most villainous. Period. Well, the villainy of another group of demons grew out of a simple, misguided sense of their own religious or political righteousness. Miserable creatures they were, fanatical and unrelenting. Thaddeus the priest in the burning, or in the golem, and Gilbert the priest in the burning. Oh, so many evil priests I've played. With their zeal to exterminate anyone that questions church doctrine. They were all other examples of this pure embodiment of pure evil. But this single-mindedness of purpose tends to limit the dramatic range of so many villains. What makes a villain uniquely interesting, I think, or at least to perform, is in his having a personality that is complex, where, for example, conscience and guilt vie with his dreadful deeds. Compare the villainy in the character of Barnabas with that of Reverend Trask. Now, fascinating as Trask is, and helped in no small measure, I might add, by Jerry Lacey's brilliant performance, nevertheless, Trask is a sort of plain-faced villain that could never sustain a series of stories over a period of 4 years of a television series, any more than the priest Thaddeus and Gilbert could sustain even the length of one play. Now, a poem written by a fan that really belongs in part 2 of this program, and is acknowledged there, illustrates perfectly the plain-faced villain I'm talking about. And therefore I'm going to read it right now. It is entitled Aristide, and is dedicated to the character of that name who appears in later episodes of Dark Shadows. Search all you want, you will find no heart within. Hearts are weak, blind, and I am determined to win. In this world of night is power more than you know, and I devour it with passion. Now, what makes Barnabas heroic, that is to say durable, is the enrichment of his character, so basically villainous, with an awakened conscience. Listen to him as he cries out in the presence of Joshua and Bathia. I see blood. I see a ravaged countryside, the people in danger, in terror. Innocent people are made monsters. I see good men turn to evil, and I see the source of this evil. I see the cause of the terror. I see myself. Now, the great tragic heroes of Shakespeare have remained mighty prototypes of guilt-ridden souls for our contemporary writers and actors dealing with the theme of evil, including the writers of Dark Shadows. And so Macbeth, with his deeply troubled conscience, proved to be so much inspiration for my work as Barnabas. And here is Macbeth on his way to King Duncan's chamber, having resolved in league with his wife to commit the murder. Go bid thy mistress when my drink is ready. She strike upon the bell. Get thee to bed. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, of false creation, proceeding from the heat oppressed brain? I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Thou marshallest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still. And on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. Now the one half world nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel the wolf, whose howl is his watch, thus with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides towards his design, moves like a ghost. Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps which where they walk, for fear the very stones prate of my whereabout, and take the present horror from the time which now seems with it. Whilst thy threat he lives, words to the heat of deeds too cold breath gives. I go, and it is done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell. After the conclusion of the Dark Shadows television series. As a matter of fact, we had our first dress rehearsal about 1 hour after our final taping. Still, Beckett represents best for our purposes here a number of modern roles that I played in the decades preceding Dark Shadows that led to the Barnabas who embodied a high sense of destiny, overcoming all obstacles, where good triumphs over evil, where there is victory over temptation. John Proctor in The Crucible by Arthur Miller is a good example. Lord Essex and Maxwell Anderson's Elizabeth the Queen, another. Well, here then is Thomas Becket at the conclusion of Act 1 of Murder in the Cathedral in the presence of the women of Canterbury, following his confrontations with each of his three tempters. Now is my way clear. Now is the meaning plain. Temptation shall not come in this kind again. For the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. 30 years ago, I searched all the ways that led to pleasure, advancement, and praise, delight and sense, in learning and in thought, music and philosophy, curiosity, the purple bullfinch and the lilac tree, the tilt-yard skill, the strategy of chess, love in the garden, singing to the instrument, were all things equally desirable. Ambition comes when early force is spent, and when we find no longer all things possible. Ambition comes behind and unobservable. Sin grows with doing good, When I imposed the king's law in England and waged war with him against Toulouse, I beat the barons at their own game. I could then despise the men who thought me most contemptible, the raw nobility whose manners matched their fingernails. While I ate out of the king's dish, to become servant of God was never my wish. Servant of God has chance of greater sin and sorrow than the man who serves the king. For those who serve the greater cause may make the cause serve them, still doing right. And striving with political men may make the cause political, not by what they do, but by what they are. I know what yet remains to show you of my history will seem to most of you at best futility. Senseless self-slaughter of a lunatic, arrogant passion of a fanatic. I know that history at all times draws the strangest consequence from remotest cause. But for every evil, every sacrilege, crime, wrong, oppression, and the axe's edge, indifference, exploitation, you and you and you must all be punished. So must you. I shall no longer act or suffer to the sword's end. Now, my good angel, whom God appoints to be my guardian, hover over the sword's points. I've lost count of the number of times that I've exclaimed and waxed enthusiastic about the amount of literature that has emerged from Dark Shadows over the years, 15 of them. And two things excite me. One is the quality of so much of the prose and poetry. And the other is so much of it has been written in the last 4 or 5 years. And it's a mystery, but it's encouraging. But way back, when we were editing, at least making the tapes of the show at the time, and the first few letters started to trickle in for me, with the letters, with their prose and their poetry, the idea lodged in the back of my mind that one day I was going to do something about it. And well, the final result is what you are going to hear now. Some of the poems will come from a collection that I've kept in boxes and closets around New York for the last, all these 15 years. But whether from way back or from more recent years, I am forced by the limitations of time to barely scratch the surface. And because I want to read from as many authors as possible, the editor's pencil has been kept busy, I regret to say. But for better, for worse, and by the gracious permission of the following writers, I give you my selection. The first one speculates on a meeting between two unusual gentlemen, one a 19th century American creator of horror fiction, and the other a modern creation of horror fiction. I prefer the phrase Gothic fiction, but be that as it may, it is a figure intimately familiar to you all. They met on a darkly drawn night in 1848, two outcasts in a world that was none of their choosing. The gaslights glowed yellow against the gloom of the chill Boston night, and men hidden in cloaks hurried along the narrow, crooked lanes to the safety and comfort of their homes. On the waterfront, the air was colder still, with an insidious dampness that bit through the flesh to the bone and marrow. Here the men were wanderers without any place they could call home but the sea. They sought shelter from the cold in the taverns that huddled along Long Wharf, the dark dens lit by feeble candle flame and small fires in their grates, were evil-looking haunts whose customers had no wish to be known. But here and there sat the more mysterious ones, who bore the mark of a gentleman, though they associated with the low and coarse inhabitants of this nether region. Whatever their reasons, they sought isolation and were never known to speak of their past. A tall, thin gentleman with a rather sinister aspect came into the tavern alone. He sat in the corner and turned his back to the door. He carried with him a wolf's head cane, the handle made of finest silver. Many an observer calculated how much such a cane would bring at the pawn shop, but no one made a move towards the man. They only watched and schemed and drank deep. The talk was low and furtive as faces bent over steaming tankards. The arrival of another gentleman, more loudly heralded, was noted by those along the bar. He was well known to most of the innkeepers of the city as a man who rarely paid his debts. The regular patrons recognized him and groaned. "Have you sold anything yet?" the innkeeper asked. Contempt flared in the man's eyes to be stifled as he replied, "I will have you know, my good man, that I have extended my nets into plentiful waters, and I expect to hear from Philadelphia momentarily. And I have high hopes for New York." The innkeeper sighed and shrugged and gave up his inquiries. He handed the man his usual drink, a glass of poor quality claret. "Red as blood," the man murmured. The innkeeper shook his head. Poor sot, he was always the worse for drink. The gentleman was small of stature, with a wide forehead, a dark mustache, and a melancholy air. His eyes were deep and dark and glowed as with a fever or countless secrets of sight seen by few. His clothing was second-hand, frayed at collar and cuffs, but he carried himself with an inbred dignity that belied his appearance. Fate had not been generous. A sailor slouched against the bar, muttered, "Why don't you find yourself a job, mate?" "I have met with adverse circumstances," he replied, "but I was recently employed and am well respected both as a writer and a poet." The sailor laughed derisively, "Bloody drunk." "Your designation of me as a drunkard is erroneous, sir. I have had many literary successes." The sailor and his friends grinned as if to say they doubted the little man had ever managed to hold a job more elevated than that of a petty clerk. A glass of claret in hand, the odd little man surveyed the dim, unlit corners of the low-beamed room, noticed the lone stranger, and made his way to the man's table. Swaying slightly, the small man said, "Ah, a stranger, and no welcome for you here. May I extend to you my own hearty welcome?" The tall, thin gentleman studied him with caution. The smaller man continued, "Unless I intrude upon some grief or misfortune and unintentionally add to your myriad burdens with the intolerable utterances of speech. For the words of the heart are never spoken, but die stillborn upon the lips of those we lament and lose." The tall gentleman accepted this flowery discourse with a faint smile, and with a sweeping gesture invited the other man to take a seat opposite him. "And what brings you to these frigid shores?" the small man inquired. "I myself am presently undertaking a lecture tour." "Oh, on what subjects do you lecture?" he was asked politely. "Oh, many subjects, sir. Lately I have been carrying on a dissertation on the poetic principle. There is also a fascination of mine, the self and the universe. I have traveled through metaphoric valleys of unrest," and here he began to recite. "Once it smiled a silent dell, where the people did not dwell." But he became confused and faltered, forgetting which words came next. "Well, you seem to speak from experience," the stranger said. The man's downcast eyes brightened. "I perceive that you have great understanding. Where are you from, sir?" "The north," the stranger said, amused. "Ah, the chilly wastes the ultimate dim fool. The other began. Oh, no, not quite such a distance as that, the gentleman said. I am from the coast of Maine. You have the look of a traveler also. Oh, most observant, the small man replied. Just as I have crossed land and sea, I have likewise traveled the inner recesses of man's soul and have viewed many wonders, some of astonishing beauty, and others of such unspeakable horror, of hellish visions too terrible to imagine. The vast abyss of the soul where the unwary traveler is beckoned beyond the boundaries of sanity to the torments of the lost. The tall gentleman listened curiously. Surely these were the ravings of the meth drinker or opium eater. What is life, the small man continued, but loss? What is there for man in his brief stay in this benighted world but the bitter taste of isolation as he roams a bleak and chilly earth? The only comfort, a mere moment of beauty, is love. An instant of joy too soon ended. From the expression on the stranger's face, it was evident that he too knew a great and unbearable loneliness, that one whom he had loved had been torn from his embrace by death. The smaller man said quietly, I have lost such a love. My young wife died not long ago. Now there can be no springtime in my heart, now that she is gone. The stranger reflected his own suffering, and a single word escaped his lips. It sounded to be Josette. But his companion could not be sure. Instead, he commiserated solemnly. Oh, the lilies free that wave and weep upon a nameless grave, they weep. From off their delicate stems, perennial tears descend in gems. His voice dropped and grew agitated, and thus does fate make outcasts of us all, doomed to wander the earth and inner regions in ceaseless journey. Our cries are crushed within our throats, but is not our doom of our own making? There is no river of blessed oblivion where we may find peace. So we must ever remember those who are gone, forever lost. Our existence in this sorry world is short and marked with tears, and we, poor mortals, are destined to dust. Beauty and love have gone, and we must wander to life's end alone. The tall gentleman's eyes narrowed slightly as he detected the thread of near insanity that betrayed the speaker. But he found his sympathies drawn to the man, for they had both known suffering, though they had traveled different roads. Each had been thrown into the maelstrom of despair and loneliness, and their twilight wanderings spoke of grave clothes and the grave. For the strange gentleman knew that the life of a vampire was an eternal night, and his search for blood had become a flight from himself and what he'd become. As the night progressed, the drunken poet fell to morose ponderings, muttering disjointed fragments of prose and poetry which preyed on his mind. When the tall man stood to leave, he made his farewell to his companion and went out into the midnight. Close behind followed one of the sailors. The loquacious drunkard, suddenly realizing that he was again alone, became possessed by some brainstorm and darted out the door after the stranger. The cold slap of water against the wharves and the tall gentleman's footsteps were the only sounds to disturb the silence. He heard his attacker's approach long before the sailor reached him and drew out a well-used knife. Don't call out, the sailor warned. I have no intention of calling anyone, the man said. Just what is it you want with me? The sailor laughed harshly. Don't give me that gun. Empty your pockets and hand me that walking stick. That's a dazzler, that is. Yes, I've always been fond of it, which is why I will not part with it. Oh my, the sailor jeered. Ain't we brave? You'll have yourself a slit throat to show for your bravery. But then he noticed how the tall man's eyes gleamed, shining and monstrous, as if they were drinking in the images of the night. His fascination grew until he could not look away, and his grasp on the knife weakened. Such was the unusual scene that greeted the drunken man as he hurried to catch up with the northern gentleman. He forgot just what it was he wanted to impart to his drinking companion as he beheld the two men locked in unmoving conflict. The sailor's knife dropped to the dock. The gentleman seemed to impel his attacker to close in as his mouth twisted in sardonic laughter, and then there came the flash of fangs sinking into the sailor's jugular vein. The small man shrank back against a wall, dizzy with a nervous convulsion from the horror he was unable to truly comprehend. He fell to the ground, unconscious. Well, a day passed into another night. The small, shabby man had been to every tavern and alehouse in Boston that day, gripped by an illness which he could not dispel. He would not rest until he had the answer he sought. "Could you tell me," he began, "did I patronize this worthy establishment last evening?" The innkeeper, bemused, said, "That you did, sir." Well, the man reacted with obvious relief. "Oh, I could not recall. Well, never mind that. Was there a tall, cadaverous fellow here carrying a silver wolf's head cane?" "Yes, indeed," he said. The man said slowly to himself that it was not a dream. Incredulity crossed his pale face. It was not my imagination, nor fever, delirium, nor hallucination. I saw. That is, I thought I saw. But it is impossible. Oh, well, I must write this down. "Have you any paper?" "No, sir." Well, I must write this down now," he shouted as he ran for the door. The innkeeper called out, "Mr. Poe, may I have a word with you about your standing debt?" But it was too late. He was gone. Well, the next time he saw the writer or poet or whatever it was he called himself, he would demand payment or else. He sighed and returned to polishing glasses. Such were the events of a certain autumn night, as cold and dark as the grave, and this the sole meeting of two haunted gentlemen who had been set adrift by the cruel mariner fate. They would meet never more in this sad world. Let me read a footnote on the actual circumstances of Poe's ultimate fate, prepared by the authoress. Following the death of his wife in January 1847, Edgar Allan Poe conducted readings and lectures. In early November of 1848, he went to Boston, where it was reported that he had taken laudanum in an attempt to commit suicide. Poe died the next year in the autumn of 1849 after he'd been discovered unconscious in the streets of Baltimore. He died without ever regaining consciousness. And now we come to the poetry. The character of Barnabas, as we discussed in part one, was first conceived as an embodiment of pure evil, courtly and gentle in manner, but consumed by the need for survival. The vampire pure and simple, best presented in this manner, I might add, probably in the movie House of Dark Shadows. Well, this quality is reflected, I think, in the following first group of poems. I am in your subconscious, ever present, often ignored, but there. I am the he, she who feeds on the warm red elixir of life. I drink. I, that dread Nosferatu, I come to you knowing your need. I am energy. I am sex, lust, desire. I, carnality. Bite the flesh, drink the sacred liquid. I look and see the blood pulsing through your jugular, waiting for my hot breath on your neck, the sharp momentary pain as my fang pierces, the joy in giving yourself to me. Know that this be true, for I am, and vampires are. Beauty and horror responsive the curses spoken, gestured, to woo the vibrations of dark, vile wings. Now time is without memory or light or darkness, without shadow, history. And the darkness does not diminish this creature to ashes. A kiss will reanimate the bone that death could not distill. Eyes and the lust of blood have taught this lover that to love is to ignore time. Gelid hands seem to crawl up my spine. Wintry winds howl and darksome slant rhyme. Though my poor body shivers, it's clear that my soul is what's frost-bitten here. In this New England Arctic of dread, even tears freeze before they are shed. Hear my challenge, Siberian hall, cool as marble, I'll outlive you all. No sound at all, just the feel of the wind on my cheek and call. Dear silent friend, this sable night, constant in her sweet allure. Our covenant is true beyond measure and beyond all age. Yes, she and I share common pilgrimage. We shall never die. Well, a little change of mood here. This is a poem that has nothing to do with the soul of man or the lack of it, or even with a struggle with evil. In fact, there isn't a breath of evil in it, but believe it or not, Dark Shadows was the genesis of some humor. And so why not a little diversion from all the solemnity? Well, this poem tells about one of the fan mail work parties held over a series of weekends at ABC Studio 16 back in 1970 or thereabouts. Our author is right here, as a matter of fact. That's how she brings the generations along. Cartons of mail have been left stacked along one wall for months during one of our busy periods, and later I took it upon myself to organize work parties from the fans who used to wait faithfully outside of the studio every day. And here is how this lady records this particular day. Once upon a time, not very long ago, there were a lot of letters for someone we all know. He needed lots of help, so lots of kids pitched in. One Saturday in the afternoon, the chaos did begin. We saw a ton of mail spread out on the clean floor. The building started trembling, expecting full-scale war. The strategy was mapped out, and everybody ready started diving for the mail. No one was quite steady. There was delightful madness and one great wall of sound. With over 30 people, chaos did, confusion did, collisions did abound. And so, like so many dying swans, the cards and letters flew in corners and on the once clean floor, some in the boxes too. Some were funny, some were sweet, some too hot to keep. And everyone wound up saying the alphabet in their sleep. Here's the AAs, the AMs go over there, there's the APs over there. Who has the pens, the letter openers, the paper things? My chair! Thank you for my chair. He's the B pioneer. The ARs aren't at this table. How did a Sally get here? Well, don't stand there reading it. Put Sally back on the S and tell me what she said later. I've never seen such a mess. Okay, we'll take the boxes home and do it our own way. Far from the noise and chaos. Please, let's do it again one day. And what was in those letters? Some were funny, some were sweet, some too hot to keep. Someone with a sense of humor answers that question succinctly, like this. Is JF your real name? Will DS last long? What do you do in your spare time? Do you like the people you work with? How old are you? When is your birthday? Are you married? And if so, any children? Any chance for a time change? How do you feel being on nationwide telly? What are your plans for the future? What is your hair color and eyes? How long have you been in show business? How did you get on DS? What other shows, movies, and TV have you appeared on? Why do you wear the ring? Is DS live or taped, and where? Persons whose thinking has influenced your life. Your height, weight, favorite foods and hobbies. How long have you been acting, and how did you get your start? What films have you done? What sort of roles do you prefer? Brothers and sisters? Do you have any pets? What is the history of DS? How long will you be on DS? What is your favorite color? What is your religion? What type of girls do you like? Have you done Shakespeare? Where born? Where do you live? How many fan mails do you have? What do you think of your fans? Do you read your mail? Are you satisfied with your present acting? Is your hair your own? Do you enjoy the part of me? Are you English? Do you have an audience? And how do we get tickets? Are you going off the air? Do you believe in the supernatural? How long have you been acting? Will B eventually be killed? Well, actually, I'm not so sure that's a valid poem. Fortunately, the author remains anonymous. But if you ask me, I think it was one of those questionnaires purloined in its entirety from 16 magazine. So it's fun to read and not meant to intimidate you, I might add, during any question and answer session. Well, back to the poems with a weightier theme. And here are a few more that begin to express Barnabas less as a vampire per se. A personality begins to emerge with soul, however besmirched, with feelings, with yearnings. The knowledge of his dreadful fate saddens him profoundly. Misconception has labeled me evil, fabled me to be but the craven dust of a man made bold by the manner of desires I let go uncontrolled. Said I must be a monster since I go sabled always by the night, cold, sans sun and lovers' fires. Candles light the arched passageway, a subterranean tunnel which leads to a world beyond, or to a darkened room lit by a single taper which stands like a sentry over an oblong box. Silence invades the darkness of that room, a cell in a dark underworld, the place where all life ends, or continues on, growing more complex like a spider spinning its web over an ornate oblong box. Sorrow burdens the soul, an essence of a thing called life, which with death is released, or imprisoned in a body racked with torment, like the soul of the man imprisoned in the ornate oblong box. And when I have fallen low, wilt thou follow the smoky path of my imprisoned wrath, along the benevolent sleep-worn stone, to dance a dance devoid of all mirth, entreating a fragile mind? Remember the days bound to night, this death denied of the eager earth. Embittered, enshrouded heart of pitch, wilt thou pen a death verse above my head? Laurel crowned, withered words kings once said, sorrow for the selling hath made me rich. Well, back to some more comic relief. A few limericks. There was a vampire named Frid. Went into his coffin he hid. He couldn't get out, and he began to shout, will someone please oil the lid? Each night a vampire would rise and say, to our utter surprise, it's true as they say, I am an actor by day, explains the bags neath my eyes. Well, here are some verses that are meant to be sung to the tune of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. Oh, Lewis, I wish you were up here helping me. I'll try my best, if I can get it on a decent pitch. My Bonnie lies over the sea. That's it. There once was a marvelous program that we all ran home to see. The scariest thing on the TV. Bring back my dark shadows to me. Bring back, oh, bring back dark shadows to me, Bring back, oh, bring back dark shadows to me. A vampire lived inside his coffin. He was hidden in the cemetery. He spent all his time hunting victims. Please bring back my vampire to me. Bring back, bring back, oh, bring back my vampire to me. Or come down to me. Bring back, oh, bring back dark shadows to me. Lovely. It's marvelous. Another one. Just two more. A vampire is at a loss when he is in front of a cross. A girl knew this and prevented his kiss, and then she showed him who was boss. A vampire had a bad bite. His uppers were rendered a sight. What could he do? For this fact is true. Most dentists won't work at night. Not said for that. Well, here is a charming poem written many years ago, which reflects upon the theme of time, a theme that writers of the series, as well as the writers for the fan publications, have always found so enthralling. Flowing, flowing like a river, weaving, growing into never, thus is time. Sweeping, sweeping all before it, laughing, weeping, try to ignore it, thus is time. Praising morning as we go, evening dawning, river flow, thus is time. Glowing, glowing like an ember, memories for knowing, remember, remember, thus was time, and thus is time, flowing, flowing like a river. Drawing near to our conclusion, an imaginary conversation with Barnabas, a rather one-sided discourse, but tenderly told by a young writer who in a remarkable way projects herself into the mind of Barnabas as he would respond to her queries. I nickname it respectfully, Pearls from Barnabas. You sit there waiting to judge me, seeking to unlock my secrets and discover my fears. I see the question in your eyes, your deep probing look of curiosity as you search my face for answers. But you will find no answers there. The only way you will find out what you must is if I should now decide to tell you, and I will. What is there for me to possibly fear? For my family? No. My sweet little sister, my dear loving mother, and my stern, unbending father were beset by the tragedies that befell them over 180 years ago. The tragedies have disappeared, as have they, like so much dust blown away by an exhaled breath of remembrance. Love. No, I'm not afraid to feel love, although sometimes I think I should be, having seen love's dark side. It was the love of two women that forever changed the course of my future. One woman, blonde and beautiful, knew my touch in Martinique. Then, lost in our intimacy, I looked and found another. The blonde seductress was not my true love after all. She was not the one. I loved a gracious soul, and I know that she loved me. Her sweet, gentle spirit was forever entwined with mine, and happiness should have been ours, but it was not. The temptress showed us her bitter, jealous wrath. The love my lady and I shared disappeared, crushed and torn among the rocks. Our precious love shattered, lost among the waves. But that is past and that is gone. Looking back at it only reminds me of how much I have lost, all of the cold winters I have known. Death, a subject with many facets that are yet unknown to you. How could you possibly know the feel of death's cold embrace and the great emptiness it leaves behind? I was young and full of light once, very much like you are now, once. And then death's deep blackness claimed me, sucked away my life. Now I wish for the peace death can bring, instead of living in emptiness and fear. Fate has cruelly planned out for me to live in torment without love, alone through time. The warm blood of others must flow through my veins, blood much like yours will sustain me. Oh, do not tremble so, I won't harm you yet. Life. You really believe that I am afraid of living in this world? Yes, I am afraid of life and a time I cannot cope with. This time shockingly different from my own. That which was my life is gone, leaving me to face a hopeless future. Through eternity. No, I cannot go on like this, killing and causing pain, trying to ignore the vampire, the animal locked within me. I seek quiet peace, the lasting peace granted to those who have died and lay in eternal slumber, undisturbed by pain, an uneasy fear of not finding or knowing such a peace. I can only hope. Am I evil? Perhaps I am to your young and innocent eyes, but to my bleary eyes, definitions have become blurred. Black and white have changed into a somber gray. And I found that good and evil are very often the same thing. Now the focus and concepts have become lost with the lapse of infinite time. Do I have a soul? Yes, though you won't believe it. When I was a young man, still naive and innocent, it shone with the brilliant radiance of its own light. Now, blackened beyond repair by criminal acts committed in my grief and rage, I have found it. I have attacked and murdered many, too many innocent people for my own protection. And though I hate myself for it, I find it's impossible for me to stop. Inflicting pain and often death is now a habit of mine. And though what is left of my once innocent soul cries out with great horror and fear, my evil soul relishes pain. I am forever lost. And you are able to do absolutely nothing that could ever help me. I am far beyond the help of any human. Thank you for your time. As much as it hurts, it was good to talk about everything once again. You were very brave to come tonight, and I thank you, as does the human soul still locked within me. And finally, an old Scottish prayer. From ghoulies and ghosties and long-legged beasties and things that go bump in the night, good Lord, deliver us.